Right now, in most organizations, they have too much change. And then that's what leads to change fatigue. And the more initiatives that fail, the less likely the next ones are to succeed. What's really important to understand is you can't move forward on the shared purpose until you have the shared values. And that's what leaders need to discover and communicate.
Welcome to the Learn It All podcast, the show for today's leaders who want to get ahead and stay ahead, because we believe great leaders aren't born or made, they are always in the making. I'm your host, Damon Lembi, two-time best-selling author and CEO of Learn It, a live learning platform that has helped upskill over 2 million people. In just a moment, I'll be joined by Greg Satell, a transformation and change expert. He's a keynote speaker and the author of Cascades, How to Create a Movement that Drives Transformational Change. Coming up, I'm going to ask Greg to share his thoughts on why most change efforts burn out and how you can flip the script, the 5 types of resistance, and why one of them isn't rational, what keystone wins are and why you must earn them early on, how you need to align people through shared purpose and values, and why real transformation doesn't spread by mandate, it spreads by movement. In an era of disruption, the only viable strategy is really change. But if that's true, why do we still see a 75% failure rate when it comes to change transformations?
Change fails because people resist it. Right? If you can overcome resistance to change, change is possible. If not, it isn't. So, and one of the first things we do when we sit down with an organization is we walk them through a resistance inventory. So our research has identified 5 different categories of resistance. 4 completely rational: lack of trust, change fatigue, switching costs and competing incentives and commitments. And then the 5th is not so rational. It is identity, dignity, and sense of self. You know, as humans, we all have attachments, and when those attachments are threatened, we act out in ways that don't reflect our best selves. And that's why whenever you set out to make an impact, there's always going to be people who aren't going to like it, and they're going to try and undermine what you're trying to achieve in ways that are dishonest and underhanded and deceptive. And that doesn't mean they're bad people. If we're honest, we'll admit we all do it from time to time. And I think anybody who's ever been married or part of a family knows that, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what do you do with that then? If they're fundamentally think about things differently than you do, and you want everybody to embrace this great idea you have, what's the game plan?
Well, so with the rational types of resistance, it really is just a matter of laying them out. I mean, people tend to be pretty insightful about their own organizations. Often, you know, for some reason, people feel if they talk about resistance, it's almost like a betrayal, like they don't believe in the idea, but that's not true at all. So taking the time and saying, you know, why would maybe people not trust us? All right. What would be the competing incentives? Why might be people and who might be having some sort of change fatigue? We have research from PwC says roughly 2/3 of employees are feeling some sort of change fatigue. When I was still running an organization, I would have people come to me and say, we need to change this or that. And I say, well, I know we need to change it, and we're not going to, because we're doing these 2 other things, and the organization can only take so much stress. So once we get those done, we can open up some capacity to take on some new things. And last, what are the switching costs? So laying them out there, people usually can make pretty decent judgments. With the resistance that is related to identity, you know, you can ask people to change what they think or do. You can't stop them. You can't ask them to stop being who they are. If you're, you know, trying to get people to adopt Agile and they see themselves as waterfall people and they feel, you know, they've been doing it that way and for 25 years and they're proud of the work they've done, chances are they'll never come along, right? Sometimes they will. But that's not where you should focus. You should focus on going to where the energy is and helping the people who are enthusiastic be successful so that they can bring others in who can bring in others still. So what we say is, number one, start with the majority, right? You can always expand a majority out, even if that's 3 people in a room of 5. But once you're in the minority, you're going to feel immediate pushback. Doesn't mean you can't invite in skeptics, but you're under no obligation to invite in bomb throwers, right? The urge to persuade is usually a red flag. It usually means that you have the wrong people or the wrong idea. Second, you can take those skeptical people and make them like an internal red team. So give a constructive outlet for their skepticism. And again, these are people who don't have an identity problem. They're just skeptical, right? And that's not bad. The third thing is and I usually like to illustrate this is to explain this scenario, right? You're in a conference room, somebody somebody proposes an idea, which is then, discussed, and objections are raised and overcome. And then as you're going to the end of the meeting and next steps are being discussed, all of a sudden somebody who hadn't said anything the entire time throws a hissy fit in the middle of the conference room, right? We've all seen that. Why does it happen? Because when the idea was first proposed, they had a reaction that was so visceral, even they couldn't articulate it. And they were sure that somebody else would see it and it would be discarded. So the first thing we know about that scenario is it was the going to next steps that triggered them. And one of the things we all think that first win, once we get that first initial win, everything's going to be downhill after that. Once we get our project budgeted or get executive sponsorship or whatever, that's almost never true. It usually becomes harder. That's when the knives come out. So that's the first thing to know about that scenario. The second one is that once they had that hissy fit, they completely discredited themselves, and no objection they could make after that will carry weight. So that's the sort of third strategy, is if you leave them alone, if you don't engage with them, eventually they will discredit themselves. As long as you don't sort of drag yourself down with them. And major changes, that's when, if you look at any major transformation throughout history, it didn't happen when people were convinced. It happened when the opposition discredited themselves. And then the last thing is sometimes often they're able to keep their composure and they just sabotage you in the hallways. And that's where dilemma action comes in. And we've seen these from Gandhi's Salt March to Martin Luther King in Birmingham, right? Bull Connor had two choices. He could let Martin Luther King march peacefully or come out with the fire hoses and dogs. There wasn't a third choice. It was one of those two things. And the way you set up those sorts of dilemmas is by identifying a shared value and then designing a constructive act rooted in that shared value. So they either need to let the constructive value go through, or they need either let the constructive act go through or violate that shared value. So for non-rational, the two things to remember, non-rational resistance, the two things to remember are A, always default to the shared value, and B, when you feel like creating a conflict, create a dilemma instead.
To kind of rewind a little bit, when we're talking about letting skeptics in, it sounds like it's okay to let them in if it's one of the first four reasons, maybe not the fifth reason around thinking and identity. And also, if those skeptics lash out, don't engage with them, because let them just discredit themselves. Let them don't get into a argument with them. They'll discredit themselves. And with the skeptics, and I've from my research.
Well, if I can just add one
Go
thing
ahead.
there,
Go ahead.
If they're actively attacking you,
Mhm.
the mistake people make is then they try to expose the attacker as something or other. You're not trying to win the argument. What you do is default to the shared value, right? So if this isn't a business, you can always say, listen, I just want to do the best thing for the customer. Whatever that shared value is that everybody agrees on in your organization, default to that shared value. Don't try and win the argument.
And with that, and like I said, I've heard you say, even with your biggest skeptics, if you listen in, you can kind of connect and find a shared value or a shared purpose within everything.
So this is a little bit more tricky. Generally speaking, when you have those irrational ones, your most active resistors who are only trying to attack you and bring you down, if you listen to how you're being attacked, and if you can identify a shared value in how you're being attacked, that's a very, very effective way of bringing other people in. Not the ones who are actively attacking you, but everybody else. And a great example of that is the LGBTQ movement, which for decades was was focused on difference. We're here, we're queer, we want to be accepted for our difference. And every time they got even a little bit ahead, they got hammered for defense of marriage and family values. Well, then how did they ever win, right? We want to live in committed marriages. We want to raise happy families. They actually took the values with which they were going to be attacked, and they said, we're just like you. We embrace those same values. Two important things to remember about that. Number one, embracing those shared values, meaning families and marriages, didn't make anybody less gay, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's you're not trying to hide your differentiating values. But once people feel that they share values with you, they're much more willing to accept difference. The second thing is the most active people who were homophobic or whatever, they didn't go anywhere. They're still there. They were never convinced. What they were was discredited. And it was everybody else who made LGBTQ rights a reality. And, now those attacks are returning, but we're never going fully back.
And so they're able really to come together to really connect more because of these shared values. Because they see, like you said, at the end of the day, we want to raise great children, regardless of who you are, or we want to be in a committed relationship. And those are a way for people to connect with each other.
Absolutely. I mean, who has a kid in school these days where there's not a family with same-sex couple? I mean, that used to be something different or strange, but now it's part of the experience. And the gay neighbor is like a part of modern life. And one of the really interesting things, the political scientist Francis Fukuyama wrote about in a recent book called Identity, is there's always an overarching identity. So, you live in the San Francisco area. You might be a Niners fan. You might not like the tush push. I, of course, am from Philadelphia. We don't see that at all the same. And so there we have very, very different identities. in very much the same way that 300-400 years ago, it might have been religion that divided us. But we can still unite on being on our common identity as football fans. And often we see in that resistance where people are fighting out their identities. Maybe you're from marketing and I'm from sales, or I'm from production and you're from logistics. And anybody who's been a part of any organization of any size knows those can become incredibly bitter, especially in an academic environment, by the way. The way to overcome those is to focus on the shared values of the larger identity.
So how do you help leaders? Because in your book, Cascades, you talk about shared purpose and shared values. How do you help them identify what their shared purpose and shared values are?
That's a really, really great question, because it's not always obvious. I mean, first of all, as a leader, that's your job, right? I mean, leaders are no longer, we don't need leaders, at least not to the extent we used to plan and direct action, right?
That's a manager.
Very few people these days are coming into the workplace and waiting for their orders, so to speak. I mean, some people still do, but most workplaces aren't like that. So that's a really, really important part of the discovery, and that's what leaders need to discover and communicate. I know when I was running I used to run media organizations, and one of my values was that the product always comes first. Every media organization, you have these conflicts between programming and sales, right? In news, that's really, really stark, and a lot of organizations have a so-called Chinese wall, which doesn't work as well as it used to. But even in fashion, where that is not quite as stark, and editorials do your editorial people, your creative people do tend to collaborate with clients. It's not quite the same, right? So that's a leader's choice. But what's really important to understand is you can't move forward on the shared purpose until you have the shared values. The shared values are a prerequisite, and it's important to be really explicit about them. And if you're not, that shared purpose will not be able to endure. And we've seen that time and time again, because at some point you're going to be sitting around the table and there's going to be a hard decision. And if you don't share values, you're not going to be able to move forward with that.
And I like what you say about values, and maybe you could even tell the IBM story where values have a cost associated with it.
Right. Yeah.
And when I was going through your work, I was sharing with my team, one of our values are, look, if we don't do right, if something doesn't go well, we'll redo it. There's an associated cost with that, so because we want to do right by the customer whenever possible.
Right. And if you're not willing to undergo costs and constraints, it's not a value, it's a platitude. And that really is the difference. Some people talk about values in terms of hierarchies of choices, but really think about what you care enough about to incur costs. That great example was from IBM, was that when Lou Gerstner came in and said, we're going to value the customer, he also said, and I'm willing to forego revenue on every sale because of it. I've interviewed dozens of people from IBM from those days, including his number 3 guy, Irving Wladowski-Berger, and not one of them thinks that IBM would still be in business if it were not for that commitment. And one of the things that Irving told me was, because the revolution was about values first and not technology and strategy, they were able to maintain those values even as the marketplace uh, shifted later on. Even as the technology would change, the Gerstner revolution was able to live on. And there was a phrase that Irving used with me a number of times. And then he emphasized, I'm repeating this on purpose because it was so important. He said, Gerstner wanted to bring IBM back into harmony with the market. Back in the 1960s, IBM came out with a product that was so incredibly strong, it allowed them to essentially monopolize the marketplace and ignore the needs of their customers, and that's what sowed the seeds of what was almost their demise. So what he was saying is, we need to get back into harmony with the market, and to do that, our number one value has to be the customer, no matter what it costs.
And the problem with IBM when he came in, because he was a client first, right? And if you had anything outside of the IBM tech stack, they would just shut you down. You couldn't work
when
with
he was in American Express, they threatened to shut down a major data center
because
just
of the
because he had
monopoly.
one piece. And he was still furious about it, even when he came in as CEO. There was something else as well that he did, because he came in and relentlessly cut costs. I mean, they needed to relentlessly cut costs. They didn't, it wasn't an option. But his very first visit as CEO, within, I think it was 2 weeks, was just down the street to Yorktown Heights. It's not too far away from the Armonk headquarters, where the legendary IBM research is. And if you've been to that building, it's really incredible. It's one of those places like the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where Einstein, that type of place where the walls have voices. And you can sort of see the legend still walking there. And that was his very first visit. And he said, we're cutting costs. We need to save the business, but our commitment to research will not end. And that made such a big difference. And I spoke to a number of people who were in that room, and that made such an enormous difference. And of course, within a few years, they had that triumph of Deep Blue was the computer that beat Kasparov. And that's what enabled, and then they became big adopters of, they were the first major corporate adopter of open source software like Linux. So that's what enabled them to actually make a comeback. But right then and there, what they needed to do to save the company was cut costs. So making clear to those really world-class scientists, I mean, Nobel Prize winners, Turing Award winners, that his commitment to them would not waver. In that moment, that had a deep cost.
We talked about change fatigue. How do you analyze when change is necessary versus when it's maybe overkill?
It's a really great question, because we kind of have this change gospel where everything's supposed to change all the time. And you really have to be conscious of that. We're right now, in most organizations, they have too much change. They're pursuing too many initiatives, too many fail, and then that's what leads to change fatigue. And the more initiatives that fail, the less likely the next ones are to succeed. So again, much like values, this has to be a leadership choice. That's going to shape what your organization is going to be. So you need to be very, very serious about which changes you choose to embrace and be very, very disciplined about saying no to change. Because if you're trying to change everything all the time, nothing's going to change.
Yeah, and that creates not only change fatigue, but I saw another statistic out there that like 44% of people just don't even believe in the change that you're trying to move forward with,
Or don't understand it.
or don't
I
understand,
think
or have no idea, and you're changing.
Yeah, that's that same PwC research about the change fatigue. About I think 66. Anyway, roughly 2/3 don't understand the change. Don't have some sort of change fatigue, and roughly half don't don't understand the change, and roughly a third don't want the change to happen anyway. But here's the thing: we also have decades of research, literally hundreds of studies that tell us that for most changes, the tipping point for change is only 10 to 20%. That's the, and there's no research that says it's anywhere close to 51.
And 10 to 20%, you're referring to the people on the team, right? That's what,
Who are participating, right?
Right.
For political and social change, it's much less. It's Erica Chenoweth at Harvard's Kennedy School estimates it at 3.5%. But the point is, you don't need to convince everybody at once, right? You just need to get a core team. The other thing we know from decades of research about change is that it's propagated through peer networks. Right? We adopt the changes we see working around us, not the ones that people are trying to sell us or tell us about. And there's lots of great research about that. Some really, really interesting research from the civil rights era about, which activists sort of during Freedom Summer went through with it. It was always related to their social ties, not to the things, other things that they responded to in surveys. But there was one in particular that I think really so illustrates it by a sociologist named William White in the 1950s. And he was observing air conditioners, right, which were a new thing in the 1950s. And as he was, and this was actually in the Philadelphia suburbs that he first started observing this and realizing it, that the back then, air conditioners, for some of your younger listeners might not realize this, an air conditioner was something that, stuck out of a window, right? There wasn't central air back then. So as he was driving through neighborhoods, he would see that air conditioners would go in clusters. They'd start in one building and start in that floor and then spread to other floors. And people weren't buying air conditioners because they heard about them. They bought them, or at least for the most part, they bought them because they went to a neighbor's house on a hot day. And that was the big driver of getting an air conditioner. And same thing with TV and lots of things. And lots of things we do it because we see it working around us.
And I've heard you say too that it goes even 3 layers deep. Like,
yeah, so
friends of friends of friends.
The 3 degrees research of by Christakis and Fowler. What they did was they went to a very, very famous heart study called the Framingham Heart Study that followed people for decades and even their offspring to understand the implications for heart health. And as they were doing this, they also gathered information about their habits. So things like smoking and obesity and all sorts. So it created this like incredible database. And with Christakis and Fowler, 2 medical researchers, they went and they looked at the networks. And what they found with even things like smoking and obesity, not only our friends, but the friends of our friends' friends are influencing our behavior, have a measurable influence on our behavior. And most of those people we don't even know. And they're influencing our behavior in ways we don't quite realize.
And so from an organizational perspective, the way you could look at that, I guess, is, instead of sending out mass communications about the changes, you like you said, you start with a small majority, and then you work outward, really, right? And it kind of connects in, and through that network, throughout your large organization, people will get bought in, not through persuasion, but I don't know if it's influence or whatever it is, but just seeing the
Well,
success.
influence is part of it, but the urge to persuade is a red flag.
Right.
If you feel that urge to persuade, you
It's
either
like
have the
pushing a
wrong
rock
people.
up the hill.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, exactly. You want to go to where the energy is. Find somebody who actually believes in it, right? And then help them to be successful. That's what we call the keystone change. And we always say, I had somebody come to me recently, a doctor who wants to change the medical system. And, we have a terrible problem in our healthcare with practitioner burnout. Terrible. With, horror stories in terms of doctors and nurses, and which we have a shortage of, and they're leaving in droves. And he himself had some issues. And so we'd said, okay, well, a keystone change always it's not a quick or easy win. It's always a concrete and tangible goal, involves multiple stakeholders, and paves the way to future change. So we started, I said, what would, can you, let's try and identify something. And he started rattling off a whole bunch of things. I said, let's just start with one. And I'm sure you've heard of the 5 whys, right?
Mm-hmm.
Toyota production system. So finally he comes up with pre-authorization. He said, it's just terrible. He told me this heartbreaking story of a man on a operating table needing a heart transplant, and the doctors are waiting for pre-authorization, and he ended up dying. I mean, it's just terrible. So, okay, pre-authorization, great. But with keystone changes, you don't have the 5 whys, you have the 3 make it smaller. Great. Pre-authorization. How do we make it smaller? Oh, what about pre-authorization just for heart transplants? I mean, that's a much stronger case than general pre-authorization. Okay, how can we make it smaller?
In surgery.
Well, we want to make it smaller. So, not just organ transplants or heart transplants or whatever it is. How about one state?
Mm-hmm.
So,
I get it.
now we've shrunk it down to pre-authorization just for heart transplants in just a single state. Well, now you're much more focused, and you can be but once you do that, if you achieve pre-authorization for anything in, say, Rhode Island, well, then you can, that's something concrete. Then you're just scaling, right? You're not talking about the nature, you're talking about the scale. So that's what you do. The same thing in organization. You say, okay, who's one guy? And, maybe we start with Bob in Toledo. Not anything about Toledo, doesn't have anything to do with Toledo, but everything to do with Bob, because Bob really wants this to happen. And what if Bob can be successful, right? Then, well, maybe the entire Toledo region or whatever, start wherever. I know there's a project at Procter and Gamble, where they got the remit to try and spread this, essentially a movement for process improvement in Procter and Gamble. Just these, just one young guy in his 30s, middle management, but he had discovered how to do something, and he won an award, and the CTO said, okay, I'll give you a year to make it work. So he just started traveling around to different facilities. He had one rule. He said, the one rule is, if you're going to join this effort, right, you need to find a partner, right? You can only start if there's 2 people. And when this was going on, Cascades was coming out. And so he read Cascades and patterned it off that. So instead of trying to go, big and wide, he would just try to find people who were really into it. And within, I think, 18 months, they had 2,500 people. It's like 4 or 5 years now. Last I heard, it was 75,000. Even in Procter & Gamble, that's a big number.
That's a big number anywhere. That's larger than Marin, where I'm at, if you look at it alone. And what I hear you saying there is, one, with Keystone changes, get different stakeholders across. You only need 10 or 20%. So start small. It could be starting with a couple people, and they have to be passionate about it, which is super important, right? And don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to go too big. Try to make it as small as possible to get a win that way, and then build it out afterwards and show it as like, hey, here's a case study of something that worked. Let's try it there.
Well, if I can just add something there, you always do keystone changes with enthusiasts, right? And you always have a couple of them, because that's always going to be iterative. But if you're doing it with enthusiasts, you can fail as many times as you need to.
I like that. I like that, right? Like with Edison with the light bulb. I mean, just keep failing until you get it right at some point.
Yeah, and we were talking about, I think before we came on, about the city I was working with that wanted to start with 40 managers. We said,
Yeah, I love that
what if
story.
it doesn't go well? They're 40 directors. What if it doesn't go well? But if you start with 12 who are really enthusiastic, they'll push right through it.
Yeah,
and once you
they
figure
believe
it
in
out,
anyways.
you give yourself some space to figure that out and iterate a little bit. You don't have to talk about, well, the first 2 times we tried it, it didn't really go that well. You say, well, you just tell them about the 3rd time, and now it's doing fantastically.
I mean, Greg, for our business, LearnIt, that was like worth the price of admission researching you coming onto this, because a lot of times when we're doing pilots, we're always trying to bring in the naysayers to try to convince them. But why do that? Why not start with the smaller group, where if things don't go well, they can come back and they can give you feedback and say, here's how we tweak it. And knowing our audience or our culture, this is what's going to be more successful. Let's try it again. And like you said, just keep pushing through.
Yeah. And it's again, going to where the energy is, right? Not trying to create and maintain it by yourself. One of the ways a change effort is going badly is when people start doing things just because they feel good, because it allows them to signal their identity and status. We've seen this with Agile. The Agile movement is on its very, very last legs. And not because of the people who hate Agile, who feel that they're waterfall people, but because the people who advocated for it discredited it in the way they advocated, because they wanted to show everybody that they were true believers, right? They wanted to talk about the Agile manifesto, which to people outside the Agile community is probably not that meaningful, rather than better projects done faster and cheaper that are shared values that everybody can embrace.
So in a situation like that, what could they have done differently?
What they could have done differently is say, rather than go back to first of all, they didn't equip their advocates and tell them not to do that, not to go back to their workplaces and try and evangelize and get everybody to believe that the same things you do, right? Or have your same goals. But to start with people who are already enthusiastic and talk in terms of shared values, better projects done faster and cheaper. But if instead of trying to go convince everybody about Agile and about Agile manifesto and believe everything you do, you just went to people who were willing, enthusiastic, shared your energy, and then you started, doing a couple of projects that were successful, then you're not talking about some Agile manifesto. You're talking about these successful projects we did, and we can help you be successful too.
When it comes to change movements, we talked about civil rights, we talked about Gandhi. I've heard you say that learning from failure is one of the biggest differences between change managements that have been successful versus the ones that have failed. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, they all failed, all of them. I mean,
Which is really important for
it,
people to understand.
the one exception being civil rights. There wasn't anything really horrible. Um, there was Martin Luther King had a couple of he had an Albany campaign that didn't go that well, but there wasn't anything terrible. But Gandhi, there was, he called it his Himalayan miscalculation. And this is something they all sort of learned over time. When he got back to India from becoming a great change leader in South Africa, he's one of the few who was able to do it more than once. He called for huge nationwide demonstrations, and it was terrible. They turned into riots, and ended up in a terrible massacre at a place called Amritsar. He would call it his Himalayan miscalculation. His Salt March, which was his most iconic moment, it wasn't because he riled the country to his cause, but because he set out with 70 or 80 of his most disciplined disciples and inspired the rest of the country by his example. Very, very different thing, almost a decade after. The very first March on Washington was not in 1963. It was in 1913, 50 years before. It was the women's suffrage procession. It was women who were marching for the right to vote. Turned into an absolute disaster. It turned into again another riot. And the leader of that movement, a woman named Alice Paul, so she learned these big gatherings are not a good idea, easy to disrupt. So her most devoted disciples, it was actually the first time anyone had ever picketed the White House. They picketed the White House with Woodrow Wilson quotes that supported their cause. And so you can see the dilemma that created, right? I mean, how could Woodrow Wilson complain when they're picketing the White House with his own quotes? So either he would have to let them continue to do it or crack down on them and look like a tremendous hypocrite. He cracked down and looked like a tremendous hypocrite. And I believe it was 1919 that the 19th Amendment was passed. And so it was only 6 years after that terrible, horrible women's procession. So all of them had to learn. Mandela and Sharksville and of course, during the color revolutions, which my friend Sir Ja was a chief architect of, we all kind of had to learn. They had their hiccups. And that, if I can, that's another really great story because you had these young kids in their 20s. They were all kind of mid-20s. They had been involved in activism in 92 against the war in Bosnia, in 96 with this Zajedno coalition, which got a bit further but ended up failing in the end. And in 1998, these 5 kids met in a cafe in Belgrade, and they talked about what had succeeded and what failed. And they realized that there was a presidential election in 2 years. And they realized that they could mobilize people, that they were really good at that. And they could mobilize people and get them to the polls. And if they realized if they could do that, they could win the election. And they knew all of this from experience. And they also knew from experience that if they won the election, Milosevic, the Serbian dictator at the time, would try and steal it. So that's what they planned for. That's what they designed their movement for. Not winning the election, but what they would do when Milosevic tried to steal it. And of course, 2 years later, they mobilized people. Well, I'm getting ahead of the story a little bit. The next day, 6 of their friends joined them. So they became, went from 5 to 11 in one day. And then 2 years later, then a year later, this movement called Otpor numbered maybe a few hundred people. A year after that, then they numbered 70,000. And they got
And that was the year of the election?
That was the year of the election.
70,000 from 11 to 70,000?
But that's how it works when we're talking about starting small. Change is nonlinear. People think you have to start fast to go fast. No, you have to start slow to go fast. They went from 5 to 11 to 200-300 to 70,000. And that's the way the math works. They got people to the polls. They won the election. Of course, Milosevic tried to steal it, and that became the bulldozer revolution. But it didn't stop there, right? Because there was, remember, this was 2001 probably at the time, and back when West Wing was a really big deal, and somebody came and did a documentary on what they did, and Martin Sheen narrated it. And so it became a really big deal. And another group of 20-year-olds, 20-somethings, they called them and said, could you help us do that? And so they did, and that became the Rose Revolution. And then some people from Ukraine called and said, could you help us do that? And that became the Orange Revolution.
Which you lived through. We didn't even get to that, but which you were involved in. Were there?
I was. But then, so that was that same playbook, and it was that same playbook. And if you look and you go look at the Otpor logo, you can see a number of movements, including the April 6th movement in Egypt for the Arab Spring, adopted that, not only their tactics, not only their principles, but their very same logo. And even still, there are a number of movements going on right now in Europe, in places like Slovakia and Georgian Republic, and those very same activists from 20 years ago are still involved.
That's an incredible story.
Five kids in a Belgrade café. They weren't rich, they weren't powerful, but they were able to make change that not only changed their own country, but to this day has changed more than 50 countries throughout the world.
That's an incredible story. And thinking about change, I mean, you've been at this over 20 years. Is there anything that you've pivoted on that you no longer believe in, that you were passionate about early on?
So many things. It's hard. I guess my initial realization was that power doesn't work the way I thought it did. That was really a big part of it, but also that point about persuasion and about communication. I came out of the media industry where communication is everything. But understanding those networks and the underlying networks and how they work. I mean, all of the things that I came to know today about focusing on starting small, that was something I had to learn from not only the research, but failure. One of the kind of misnomers now is everybody says, well, the problem, we don't have change network, we don't have big, successful change movements, is we don't have a Martin Luther King, or Gandhi or something like that. There's no charismatic leader. Charismatic leaders don't matter. In most of these movements in Eastern Europe, we didn't even know who the leaders were. Certainly not in...
A lot of confusion.
And I will tell you this, and this is something I haven't really written about, but last year I got to meet Viktor Yushchenko, who was the big figure in the Orange Revolution. He was really what the revolution was about. He was the opposition candidate for president. And he was poisoned. The Russians poisoned him, and his face was terribly disfigured.
I know, I'm aware. What was it like meeting him?
He was, well, I'll tell you that in a second, but first I want to tell you this very quickly, the story, because it explains who he is and what he's like. I mean, and even in person, and we were with a very small group at dinner. It was only about his wife, him, and I think a dozen other people, and only half of them didn't speak any Russian or Ukrainian. But he's the worst politician ever. 100%, very professorial, very much like the central banker technocrat he was. He can't stay on message. He's just, even in casual conversation, he's all over the place. I mean, he's a mess that way. And that's how people knew him, this guy who could never communicate well. He was a terrible communicator, terrible speaker, not very charismatic at all. And then they poisoned him. And people thought, well, that's the end of it. I mean, the only reason he had even a chance is he had this reputation for integrity. But his face was terribly disfigured, and everyone said, well, how can he even campaign? And first of all, it almost killed him, but how can he campaign looking like, a horror show? So he gets out of the hospital and he marches straight down to Parliament, and he doesn't hide his face. And not only does he not hide his face, he points to it. And here this guy just out of his hospital bed, he said, look at my face. Look at my face so that this doesn't have to happen to you. And in that moment, he was transformed from this boring, technocratic, non-charismatic, horrible communicator of a politician into an inspirational figure. And the world changed that day. It would have been very different if he hadn't done that. And so at this dinner with just a handful of people, I got to ask him about it. And he said, I said, what was going through your head at the time at this moment? And he said, well, I always just believed in the Ukrainian spirit. And I realized that was a phrase he kept repeating throughout the entire night. And it was just this one guy who, in many ways, was not a great politician. But that one thing, he so believed in what he was doing and who he was doing it for, he was able to change the world.
Well, that's an amazing story. A great one to end on. Greg, I mean, this has been awesome. I mean, trying to recap a little bit of what we talked about. And we talked a little bit about your book, Cascades, what a keystone change is, starting with a small majority. Talked a lot about the 5 resistors of change, how to handle skeptics and when to engage with them and when not, the power of networks and those 5 kids and the story of the playbook that they've created, which is incredible. And man, it's just been awesome. Is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I just think that last point where I hadn't realized it until, I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years. And it was just last year when I met Yushchenko, that one thing is, the power of belief. It means a lot. As long as you're disciplined about it, as long as, you're looking for, believers, not, you're looking for converts, not heretics. You don't get your identity and status and signaling who you are or what your ideas, but just having faith and believing, and being faithful to that, you can accomplish a lot.
And like you mentioned several times, I want to point out, going to where the energy is.
Going to where the energy is, yeah.
Awesome, Greg. Awesome. Where can our listeners connect with you at?
Well, either of my websites, gregsatell.com is where you go if you want to work with me. digitaltonto.com is where you go if you want to read me. And feel free to connect on LinkedIn.
And so listeners, I want you to do me a favor. If you know somebody who's in an organization that's maybe going through change, or it doesn't even have to be an organization, it could be personal change, share with them this conversation today. I think that they'll get incredible value out of it. And so, Greg, I really appreciate all the time you've taken and the great stories you've told. Your book in Cascades, there's even more great stories in there. So listeners, check that out, go pick it up. And until next time, everybody, stay curious, keep learning, have a great day.
The fundamental problem is that we're wired to look after our own groups first, right? Like that we, of course, want to look out for ourselves, but we want to protect